I got to push back. I got to ask you some questions. The hell with justice? The hell with justice? There's one argument, which is whatever the socio-economic, family structure, neighborhood integrity consequences of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or the Brown decision of 54 and efforts to implement it by desegregating schools, whatever the knock-on consequences that you might speculate would have flowed from that, the Constitution required, and the basic premises of equal citizenship required, strenuous intervention in these years from 1945 to 1970 to transform the legal regime so that equal citizenship was a reality for Blacks.
Shelby, what killed Michael Brown?
What killed Michael Brown, we argue, is this liberalism that came out of the 1960s that was much more concerned, because it was also a confession on the part of white America to centuries of collusion with evil. When you confess to something like that, you give people a cudgel to hit you with for forevermore. And whites have suffered, it seems to me, since the 60s with this deficit of moral authority that comes from having confessed to evil. We know you did it. It's obvious. And so they are put in, this is what I call white guilt, is this the defensiveness that has developed in white America. And whites now have become much more interested in relieving that tension, that guilt, than in seeing to the development of Black Americans. And so the in that sense, white guilt is this makes room for all sorts of machinations, and what right away President Johnson comes with Great Society, war on poverty, school busing, affirmative action, expanded welfare payments, on and on and on, with programs and policies that were designed to relieve guilt in white America, bring back innocence, and bring back the moral legitimacy of American government. And in many ways, it was successful in achieving that. But it didn't do anything for the development of Blacks. We're farther behind today than we were back in the 50s, whites. And so that's I think that the circumstance that we end up with.
Why?
Okay. Go ahead, John, again. Go ahead.
Shelby, I've wanted to ask you this for basically 30 years. I mean, everybody should know that the reason that this linguistics professor is sitting here talking to Shelby Steele and Glenn Loury is Shelby's work. Shelby, I've read every word you have ever written on race. Every word. You inspired me. But something I've always...
You inspire me.
I doubt it. I have always wanted to know, you were participating in the Great Society programs, and you always say, well, they didn't work. And I know you know why they didn't work because you were there, but I wasn't. And I have always wanted to know, like, for example, you give the example in the documentary that you had this program that was set up and none of the guys came. They didn't show up. But that's just one thing. You would think, looking at all of that alphabet soup, all of that New Deal sounding stuff, that the Great Society programs would have turned Black communities upside down, and they just didn't. This is a genuine question. What was wrong with the programs, or why didn't they work? What happened in the communities that you saw?
What was wrong was, I think, one single thing. All those programs that you just mentioned, that I just mentioned, stole away from Black people agency over their own fate. Mm-hmm. When you and you can see it in our love for protest. Protest is always the way you're basically putting your fate in the hands of the people that you're protesting. We put our fate in the hands of white people who we said that oppressed us. We're now going to protest, give us freedom. So responsibility for our fate, for our life, went into the hands of whites, not us. One of the points we try to make is that Blacks were doing much better in the 40s and 50s moving slowly, coming in the post-war world, moving into the more and more into the middle class and so forth, then immediately at virtually the historical moment when the Civil Rights Bill is passed, finally validating our freedom, we begin to decline. We decline because we put our fate in their hands, and they anguish and they fight and argue over, is affirmative action good or bad? Is this, now it's policing? Do we have, all these false, phony issues, because we refuse to look at the simple, blatantly obvious issue, which is that we as Black Americans have not taken enough responsibility for our own advancement. We keep getting lost in the notion of justice and injustice. And we want justice, and we want to get away from it. The hell with justice. Why not just get ahead? Why not become competitive with everyone else in American life? That's, until we do that, it won't happen.
Hold on. I'm sorry to interrupt, man, but I got to push back. I got to ask you some questions. The hell with justice? The hell with justice? You don't like busing? Busing? You don't like? I mean, we're talking about basic civil rights here. So there's one argument, which is whatever the economic, family structure, neighborhood integrity consequences of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or the Brown decision of 54 and efforts to implement it by desegregating schools, whatever the knock-on consequences that you might speculate would have flowed from that, the Constitution required, and the basic premises of equal citizenship required, strenuous intervention in these years from 1945 to 1970 to transform the legal regime so that equal citizenship was a reality for Blacks. That's what Selma was about.
That's absolutely right. That's great stuff.
Okay, now, and so, okay, then I want you to expand on that, but let me just put a put a codicil on it, which is Blacks are not the only people at the butt end of the welfare state. Blacks have never been a majority of the people who are poor in the country. Medicaid is not about Black people. AFDC is not about Black people. It's about Americans, of whom some are Black people. But to read social policy in the 1960s through the lens of race is perhaps a mistake, since the war on poverty was not just a war on behalf of the Black poor. Okay, so you have those 2 points. Civil rights are an imperative regardless of their consequences. And the welfare state in America is not mainly a response to the racial exigency. It's a response to socioeconomic inequality more broadly.
And yet, we have not taken enough responsibility for ourselves to have achieved parity with whites. We didn't do it.
I agree with that.
And that's the big unsayable thing. I say it because I'm just tired of dancing around it. We didn't do it. Yes, we had all that, just as you identified there, we had all this wonderful legislation passed, just confirming our right to exist as human beings and thus and so forth. We didn't do it. We didn't say the number one goal of Black America, make sure your fourth grader can read at grade level. If he can't, he's gonna have a tough life. If he can, he'll do pretty well, no matter whether there's racism or not. You and I did pretty well. We grew up in segregation. Somebody somewhere asked something of us. Demanded, my father, if I told him I'm Black and therefore I can't do well in school, I don't even need to go there. I don't even need to go, because everybody knows. And everybody in my neighborhood. 2 houses down, Melvin Van Peebles grew up, who invented independent film in America. 4. Down 2 blocks away, Linda Hawkins went to be a PhD biologist, University of Michigan. Head of the FBI in Western America. Poor Black neighborhood. The richest man in the neighborhood was a Pullman car porter. They were Black aristocracy, along with postal workers. Well, As soon as we get into the 60s and 70s and so and beyond, all that's gone. The government now is going to give us all these programs and all these fascinating concepts of, convoluted notions of equality and so forth. And we didn't do it. And it was still today, we can still wring our hands, and unless we do it, it won't get done. The obvious question here is, well, doesn't that leave white people off the hook? My feeling is the greatest mistake Black America has ever made is to try to keep white people on the hook.
What would you say to...
One thing that's very interesting about Poor Igo, the housing project in St. Louis, the north side of the city is Black, the south side of St. Louis is white. But in the housing project, they took the north half and that would be for the white people. And the south half, Poor Igo, would be for the Black people. When they got there, most of the whites, I think almost all the whites, and a lot of the Blacks realized that this was a trap. So that's one thing that sort of left out is there are a lot of Black people with their own aspiration, the more aspirational left. So you had the one that formed the underclass stayed in there. And part of what's interesting if you read it, like the oral testimonies of these people, is that they kind of looked at the housing project as sort of a reparation. They thought that they were owned. And why would you not think that you were owned? I mean, you just came up in Mississippi, you came up in the South. And here they give you this gleaming tower. You have a view of the St. Louis Arch, which, by the way, sits on land that was primarily industrial and a major employer for African Americans before it was torn down. So I'm just saying, when you think about that, all of the history, you're left with an underclass that did not have the understanding or the ability to move on. And so that underclass is still there. This is generations later. So a lot of Black people, to the credit, that's one thing they always have to be kind of putting into frame. If there are a lot of Black people got out, they moved out, and that's why we have, 4 centuries of oppression. I would think any group has made the most progress in the history of mankind than Blacks in America. We still have that population, though, that's left behind, and they're very dangerous circumstances.
It's very powerful.
There's a difference, though, between poor 1950 and poor 1980. You know, I've never fully understood the argument, and Eli, pardon me if I'm misconstruing, fully understood the argument that when poor people all live together and the doctors move away, that there's necessarily going to be a disaster. And this is going to seem almost too tidy to be true, but it happens to be true. I knew somebody who died at almost 100, who had, been part of that Pruitt-Igoe story. And I didn't know her well, but I knew her. And I knew her daughter, who is now septuagenarian. And then there's the generations below. And you see a sea change. Like the older woman worked cleaning houses until she couldn't, way past 90. Wouldn't have thought otherwise. And her daughter is the same way. Then different things happen as you go down the generations. There's a whole different way of approaching things. And I can't help thinking that that has something to do with the new cultural shift that there was in these housing projects. There's the idea that the projects were built too far from the street, and the architecture made it so that there was less of a sense of community. But I've never been sure that those things would have been so decisive if it weren't also for that new mood in the air at that time. And so just musing about things. Excuse
me, John. I was just going to comment. There's a book. I wonder if you guys know it. It's called The World of Patience Groans by a guy named Scott Davis. It's published probably about 30 years ago. It tells the story of a princess. Her name is Patience Groan. She's a Black woman. She's born to African Americans in the hill country of Virginia who own their own land and are yeoman farmers. She's a princess because she's raised in a very privileged environment, relatively speaking, in terms of material circumstances. And she is held in the highest regard by her parents, and she's got the education. She's playing the piano, and they want to marry her off to a good guy, and they marry her off to a good guy who gets a job with the railroad, makes a decent salary, and they move to Richmond, Virginia, and they buy a little house in the neighborhood that ends up being model citied into some kind of big housing development thing. But in the decades that she's there, from like 1920 to 1950 and raising her family, the community is solid. It's not rich, but it's not poor. It's got a lot of integrity and strength. But she presides, I should say, watches toward the end of her life, the descent of this community into a ghetto. And it happens by degrees, and it's a slow motion explosion of the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex. It unfolds in slow motion. The integrity, the moral fiber, the Christian piety, the Victorian work ethic, the sense of morality, the intact families, the work ethic, it was all there in 1930, and it was all gone by 1960. And it's an extremely told through the life of
What's the name of that book?
The World of Patience Groans.
The only thing that confuses me.
It's a book called Behind the Ghetto Walls by Lee McWhorter.
Rainwater, I know that one, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a really good story at the beginning about Thomas Coolidge, who is a black guy, young black guy, like 21 years old. He got a baby, he got a wife. So you should read it. It is fascinating because it's in his own words. It's the Washington University student just basically put a microphone in his face and he talked. And it's fascinating because in the opening, he is trying to have a job. He's trying to do everything that he can do. But you have to remember, they tore down all the factories. They tore down all the jobs around them. They built these housing projects. They built the artists. So they took away a lot of resources for these people. And so here he is in Pruitt-Igoe. And you're with the poor people, like Ms. Yarman talking about, you're talking around poor people. You're not with people of your own choosing. We move should be around people that we want to be. And these people don't have that choice. So you're stuck into the low common denominator dominate. And so that's the person that rules the housing project, whether that be the drug dealer, the gangster, the pimp, or something. I'm not exaggerating, it's that bad. And what he states, Thomas Coolidge states, is they want you to submit. They want you to give up your faith that you should be in a progressive American citizen. They want you to give up all of that. So by the end of it, it's only like 30, the book is about 500 pages, but this section is only about 30 pages. By the time he gets to the end of the 30 pages, he's a black nationalist. He wants to go kill white people. He wants to do all of these things. So how you devolve like that? Well, that was the energy that was in this housing project. There was not it was detrimental. And my dad was talking about it, and I thought he was exaggerating. No, I mean, if you get further into the book, this TC cares about steps. This TC cares about all these values. These are 5-year-olds, these are 6-year-olds. So it's the whole culture that it ain't not only black. If you go into other cultures, like if you go into Native Americans and blacks have been targeted by the government in the same way. And we're the two voiced off groups in the country.
You know, something I've never completely understood is when you read about Pruitt-Igoe and places like that, everything starts to fall apart always about 5 years earlier than I would have expected. And I'm probably just being too picky. But you start seeing this change in, say, 61, 62. And I always found myself thinking, shouldn't that really have started in, say, 67, 68, after the Great Society legislation kicks in? And I don't know the answer to that question. And there's also just this phase shift difference between Pruitt-Igoe 1961, 62, where having a child outside of wedlock is no longer that big a deal, but it's still considered unusual. It's still a topic of conversation. It's not the default choice. Where there are knives, but no guns, murder is not default yet. And 1975, something clearly, as people in those places often said, something went crazy in the early 70s. But I do sometimes wonder what was going on in 1961. What had happened after the 50s? And I would have to study more to understand.
Well, remember that Moynihan's report is 1965, but it's looking backwards.
Right.
I mean, he's basically talking about what happened after the Second World War to, the war on poverty in that interval, and he's in effect forecasting the debacle that was to lie ahead.
Mm-hmm.